Psychologists of Reddit, what made you realize you were treating a psychopath? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Vancher channel. Also, please share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let's get started. Story 1. Clinical psychologist here. At first, I didn't know. If anything, given the context, he was more put together than most of my patients. The subject of his criminal past came up. I only knew he had served prison time some years before, not what he was in for. I had met with him a month or two when this came up. Turns out it was 2 separate sentences served. Both were for violation. In both cases, he was the exact thing we are afraid of. A guy lurking in a dark alley jumping a tipsy girl. He told me about these things as if he was talking about the weather. When it dawned on me that he expressed no remorse or guilt whatsoever, I got the same cold, gut-wrenching kind of primal fear you feel when you're out for a walk and almost step on snake. Answer: do you think it's possible for children to be psychopaths in very rare cases? Because in my work, I have met at least one child for sure who I got that primal fear feeling with, and he also showed no remorse for anything. Saw him feel very sad for his own life circumstances, which were pure hell, but no remorse for his own actions that hurt others at all. Of course, the school did not have a counselor because there's never any mental health issues in kids raised in poverty by addict parents, right? Sarcasm. He was the only little kid I've ever felt that primal fear around. I have literally prayed in years since that he got the serious mental health help he needed. Story 2. I am a mental health professional working in corrections, max security facility. In my experience, psychopaths will have this predatory stare, especially when they are trying to manipulate you. It is completely unnerving and hard to describe to someone unfamiliar with this population. They also tend to be narcissistic and overly charming, making a point to be overly friendly with you. Answer: I know this look. I knew a substances dealer, and he had this look to him. He would smile and try to be charming and engaging, but his eyes said something else. Usually when people smile, like a real smile, their eyes seem to have life and joy, but his seemed almost dead inside, almost like snake eyes. He'd try every trick to get you to like him, but something always seemed off. Adding to that, he always tried to do something sort of pushy to get his way, like asking for hugs and trying to force it, even when I'd say no. It was always very subtle and calculated. I think that the eyes are always the most telling when you meet someone like that. They always seem dead and cold inside, even if they try their hardest to seem normal. Story 3. When I was a student, we had an interview with a lady that eliminated her baby child with a handgun because it cried so much that she couldn't take it. At first, we weren't told that she was a psychopath, and we were just told to listen to her side of the story. She was reading us from her journal that she made while she was in the institution. Not once did she mention that she was sad that her baby died, or how what she did was bad. She was just reading angry thoughts about her husband that left her and turned her in the police about what she did. She was justifying the eliminate because the baby was so unbearable. And once she mentioned that she was angry and mad that her husband did not believe her, that she didn't have any other choice but to eliminate the baby. She was very smart and well-spoken, and the whole time she was speaking, she was trying to make us feel sorry for her for being locked up. We later learned that sometimes she was lying about not eliminate her baby, and other times just brag about it, depending on who she was speaking with. Very normal-looking person and very good speaker. Edit. Wow. Was not expecting this much upvotes. So to answer some of your questions, I am not from the US, and I don't think her name will matter to any of you. She was not schizophrenic, nor had postpartum psychosis. If she did, she would have felt any kind of remorse about what she did, which she did not. When I said normal person, I meant it in a way that if I was talking to her in any other situation but this, in a mental institution, I would have no idea that she is a psychopath. She eliminated her baby only for one simple reason. At the moment, it just wouldn't stop crying. She didn't try to hide it or anything. At first, she lied to her husband that it was by accident, but then she admitted. Answer: I know what you mean, it's chilling. Took care of a very normal-seeming woman after she delivered her baby, only to find out a few months earlier while pregnant, she take down her beautiful 1-year-old. I went back and looked at her FB posts to try and get a handle on it, and it was like the poor little guy just disappeared one day. She never mentions him dying. Life just went on its merry way. He was there one day and never mentioned again. She kept posting like she had nary a care. A day or two after his passing, she's posting one of those silly tests you can take to see if your name predicts your personality or some bullshit. Then there are posts where she's pissed at her SO or loves her SO and goes on and on about him. He is a different SO than the father of her first child. but hasn't been charged with any wrongdoing. She told everyone her oldest had SIDS, but he had a fractured skull. She was not allowed to take the new baby home and arrested shortly thereafter. As far as I know, she's still in jail. It was so hard seeing videos she'd posted of her older baby before he died, learning to do things like crawling, only to think you'll never get to grow up. I lost my first child, and I can't imagine just editing her out of my life even now, 30 plus years later. I know some people can't talk about their loss, but this was different. It was as if her older child had never been. I've been an RN since my early 20s and consider myself good at reading people. And I have to say, you cannot spot psychopaths. They act just like you and me until suddenly they aren't. Story 4. When telling that he kept thinking about how eliminate people would be more fun than lame animals, stray cats and dogs and everything else he could catch. Only 11 years old. Answer. My mom worked with a boy, 12 to 13 at the time, who had eliminate animals. He'd violation a sheep, then cut its throat. He'd molested his younger brother. He was big for his age and wouldn't be allowed to be alone with female staff because he would always try to manipulate them and test his strength against them in subtle ways. I.e., he tried to hug them but squeezed to see if they were strong enough to get out of it. They would often find drawings in his room of women tied up and mutilated. He wasn't allowed human-like toys anymore because he'd always destroy them, hang them, tie them up. The staff have all said it's only a matter of time before he actually eliminate a human, and at present, there's nothing they can do about it, because when he hits 16, he'll no longer be in their care. They had a certain degree of sympathy for him due to his upbringing. His mother was a junkie and would often sell him and his brother to pedophiles. They'd pick the boys up in a car, take them away, abuse them, and then bring them back to her. Disgusting. Story 5. Current psychologist working in a prison here. I've worked with 3 individuals I dare say would have met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder within the last 2 weeks. One commonality is that they use behaviors as tools to benefit only themselves. Self-harm not because they wish to hurt themselves, but to use it as a tool to lure staff into the cell, to incite violence, gain extra medication, be sent to the SHU, which comes with a status. Answer. I worried for a little while I might have ASPD, or I forget the one that people misnomer as sociopathy, but that one, because I saw many people and behaviors as means to an end. That self-harm one rings true. I saw it, coldly and objectively, as a way to get people to prioritize my needs, and also as a way to get a calm high so I could function through panic attacks. I would just sort of hit a wall where I'd be like, okay, I don't want to feel any more emotion. Time to cut my leg up. For this severity of emotion, I think 3 medium-length lacerations with a bread knife ought to do the trick. Sometimes is even use lidocaine gel because I wanted the euphoric effects of blood loss, but wasn't in the mood, didn't have the energy to deal with the pain. It was just a substance stool for me. Later found out a lot of my behavior motivations more closely fit borderline and/or DID. I'm in talks with my psychologist about it now, and very happy to be learning more about myself, because that undiagnosed living with mood disorders shoot is for the birds. Story 6. Not a psych, but I was in the room where my mom was being evaluated. Well, I wasn't in the room. It was like a police interrogation room with the one-way glass. I was there because they needed to interview me for an outsider's perspective. Anyways, my mom got arrested on suspicion to commit a violent crime. To set the scene, she was handcuffed to a table and she was pissed. She's always had volatile anger issues due to heavy substances and adult beverage use. She was being talked to, questioned, all this other stuff. I was there for about 3 hours. She kept running this lady in circles to divert her from the actual problem. She was insanely calm, answering questions about various things that would scare a normal person. She barely showed empathy for anything, and it was terrifying for me to watch. I knew she wasn't right in the head anyways. She was abusive to both my brother and I. But seeing how she handled the situation at hand, I'm glad I got out of there, or it would have gotten much worse. I haven't talked to her in about 4 years, but she's tried to get in contact. I can't trust her and don't think I ever will again. Story 7. Not a psychologist, but a nurse who sees way too many psych cases. One time I had a PT who was brought in after trying to break into a family's house while they were home. He was on my telemetry unit because his electrolytes were out of whack, and he was acting like he didn't remember trying to bust into an entire family's house with them home. He was getting antsy, but the hospital I worked at had a stupid fall risk policy that kept patients in bed, even if they were young, healthy, capable of being responsible for their fall. Mental health patients like to pace, especially when they start to feel like they're using it. So anyway, I'm trying to keep dude in bed because if his feet touched the floor, a loud alarm would go off, pushing his crazy jerk closer to the edge. So I'm in there trying to talk to him and de-escalate. We're talking, and he tells me he is a bad person, that his cat was mutilated, and his sister asked what happened to it, and he told her the dog did it. But he told me that his secret is that he did it. He eliminated the cat so bad that it looked like a dog ripped it to pieces. He also shared with me that he knew what he was doing when he tried breaking into the family's home, and that he wants to hurt people. Of course, I shared this info with the hospitalist and the psychologist, and naturally, he was discharged free and clear the next day. No follow-up with the law or outpatient psych. Gotta love it. Story 8. You feel it in your gut first. Using a validated measure and constructing a thorough case history to discuss in supervision. This is how you test your gut feeling, but you feel it often quite quickly. It tends to begin with just a sense that something is off. When you're doing therapy with someone, we tend to build up quite a strong rapport with people. So there's lots of micromimicry going on, and you start to tune in quite deeply to unconscious body language. When you're in this state, sometimes you just start to feel very uneasy, and you can't articulate verbally exactly why yet. This is often because of subtle micro-expressions, super fast flashes of emotion, lasting fractions of a second, that we perceive but don't consciously register. You see flashes of contempt-related emotions and burglar smiles, basically emotions related to dominance and deception. The next thing you'll notice is a lot of use of projection going on. This starts quite quickly, usually in an assessment session. I mean, as an aside, being assessed by someone else can feel quite threatening to anyone's self-image, let alone a psychopath's. Quite predictably, there will be status challenges, asking you about your credentials, your experience, etc. And then often some put-downs and digs with plausible deniability, e.g., joking that all psychologists are mad themselves, or just turning the tables by asking who's the maddest person you've ever treated. You start to feel on the back foot and like you're now being assessed by them. As time continues, they will attribute a lot of their own emotions to you as the projection deepens, e.g. commenting that you look sad, asking if you're okay, or conversely, asking why you got angry just then. As time passes, their effect turns from micro-expressions to more overt dominance displays, leaning back, smirking, getting up and striding around, etc. By this point, your initial gut feeling is getting more supportive evidence, and it's time to bust out the validated measures. The biggest sign of all is a general unwillingness to show any vulnerability at all, or to be in a one-down position. The engagement will be superficial, often pally or matey, with lots of banter and joking, always flying close to the wind of outright mockery and contempt. They will start subtly and increasingly become overt in their need to control and dominate the therapy sessions. If the therapist maintains an aloof control, the ante may keep being raised and even end up with overt intimidation of the therapist. Story 9. Often there is a particular face they make when they are relating a story, usually about how clever they are. One of the TED Talks on how to spot a liar calls it duping delight. Sometimes they can't contain their rage and you see them switch. Edit. Last sentence is a personal observation, not related to the TED Talk. Edit. To add link. We had to watch it for our criminology class. As other posters have noted, there is no evidence-based way to spot a liar. I just found the duping delight fascinating. I also see it in the faces of my young niece and nephew at times. Answer. This happened to me with a student of mine. I caught him plagiarizing a paper that I, the professor, had written. He tried to say he should still get a grade because those were his real thoughts. They just happened to align with mine, which is why he, took my paper and simply put his name on top, like I wouldn't notice I wrote it. I was honest and told him it sounded like he was having trouble taking personal responsibility for his actions. He disagreed and said he took full responsibility, then asked me if he could rewrite the paper. I said no. Rage and revulsion twisted onto his face, and then very quickly went away, and he went back to his good old boy act. Scared the shoot out of me. It creeps me out because now I notice his act all the time. He is obsessed with making it seem like he's perfect, when he's obviously used to weaseling his way through life. When he talks to the girls in my class, I cringe internally, because what if he tries to date them? Oof, bad vibes. Story 10. I'm on to you, OP. Manipulate the psychologist into telling you how to avoid being caught out. Classic psychopath maneuver. Story 11. However, I have very low self-esteem. I do not manipulate people as far as I can tell. My former roommate, on the other hand, was a narcissist to a trash-deep T, to the point where she abused and manipulated me in so many ways over the course of a year. Yet the descriptions in this thread are conflating. So what other traits of a psychopath are there? What differentiates us? Answer. I read that the lack of empathy in autism and the lack of empathy in psychopathy are actually different things. I can't remember the specific terms used, but it was something like cognitive empathy versus what we would think of as real empathy, understanding versus feeling. A psychopath would have high cognitive empathy, meaning they can read what other people are feeling, but low real empathy, meaning they can't feel it themselves. This means they can do what they need to make someone feel what is useful to them, without feeling any of the negative emotions themselves. Autism is supposedly the opposite. You feel what other people feel, but you can't process the emotions like most people. So you can't make the connection that you taking action A leads to someone feeling emotion B, at least not intuitively. But you still feel the emotional consequences, even if you don't understand why. This is what leads to being overstimulated. I don't know if that's accepted science, but it made sense to me. Story 12. This thread is interesting, so I thought I'd contribute. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a criminologist. Obviously, it's not the same sort of thing, and I've never been in a clinical situation, but you might be interested in some related experiences. Note here that I'm going to be very careful with my language in order to maintain professional integrity. Apologies for the stilted language. I've been to a couple of prisons for academic stuff and work. These are not actually all that interesting, because I knew what the people in there were for, and it wasn't as if I was surprised that some of them were psychopathic. But those would be my first experiences. But my area of professional and academic expertise is child intimacy victimization. I've very occasionally seen psychopaths in the making, as it were. Victims who have been so terribly victimized and neglected that you can see them setting out on the path of an abuser or other type of criminal. It wasn't my responsibility to intervene, and I don't have any expertise in that area of things. But knowing the case histories, it was sad to watch. I've talked to a few police officers, social workers, and so forth about a few of them. It's like watching a large tree toppling in slow motion. You know it's going to crash into the ground, but there's not much you can do about it. I have met, in a professional capacity, but in a roundabout sort of way, as it's not the usual stuff I do, the relative of a serial killer who was also once a suspect. I came away from that meeting knowing with certainty that they were the guiding hand behind the crimes of the serial killer. The police were pretty sure as well, but there was simply no evidence. Both are now deceased, and frankly, I'm not going to shed any tears for them. There was definitely familial abuse there as well. I have encountered some persons, a very small number, that were psychopathic and quite smart. This was through working within my field. One of these persons indicated that they were abusive towards animals in lieu of, or to work up to, children. I'm not going to repeat it, but what they said was something that haunts me to this day, and I haven't even been able to repeat to my closest friends, or even my psychologist. Another one of these persons escaped justice. A very, very smart person. It was no one's fault. The investigation was excellent. The police were great. Everything lined up and a lot of justice was achieved. That person, however, escaped justice by being very, very smart. They were responsible for very serious, sustained offending and would definitely be classed as a psychopath. Last, I met a friend of a person who used to be within my social circle, who was also victimized in their childhood. I have a suspicion, without any solid evidence, that they have committed serious crimes. They hold down a professional job and are very successful in life. From the standpoint of someone who cannot diagnose psychopathy and was not treating or analyzing them, but has studied it, I would say that they lack any real empathy or conscience. A lot of their emotions, but not all, seem to me to be a simulated and conscious act. The abuse they suffered was of the worst possible kind. As a result, they were wary of most men, but warmed up to me a little due to the work I do. Abuse and neglect during the formative years seem to be a very common thread for many criminals and psychopaths. That said, I dare say there are some who are just wrong in the head, but I, personally, haven't encountered any of that sort. I'll end this already too long post with a word of caution to everyone reading. It's very easy to be horrified of the actions of psychopaths and criminals. It's easy to be fascinated by their psychology, but these are people, just like we are. Most of the time, their actions can be traced back to what happened to them, how they interpreted it, how they learned from their life experiences. There, but for the lottery of birth, there aren't any evil monsters living under bridges or in forests. It's just us. We bear responsibility for the evil of psychopaths as a society, as communities and nations. We create the conditions for crime and evil. We are the monsters, and we create the monsters. As Oscar Wilde put it, we are each our own devil, and we make this world our hell. Story 13. The eyes, when they believe they're supposed to put on an emotion. You have to understand, it's going, ouch, when you bang your funny bone, even though it doesn't hurt. Because all your life, people have cried out in pain when they've banged their elbow. You meet enough people like that, and you find yourself hating any obligational situation in your life when you have to lie. Like being asked how you are and saying good when you're not, simply because all you can associate it with is them. Story 14. When describing some of the awful things he had done to people, he didn't express remorse, regret, or even anger. He expressed disdain. He was disdainful of people that he had irreparably harmed because he did not get enough out of it. He used them for his own ends, and he genuinely believed that they had failed him. Story 15. This article from the NY Times still haunts me. Can you call a 9-year-old a psychopath? I often wonder where the kid is now. What options would the parent have? Answer. The answer to that question is kinda. The term psychopath isn't a clinical one. Instead, we have a subset of disorders known as ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder. Children cannot be diagnosed with ASPD and have a different term with similar diagnostic criteria known as conduct disorder. So, yes, you can call a 9-year-old a psychopath, as that's not scientific, but you cannot diagnose them with the disorder people often intend to reference, but are unaware of when they say psychopath, as one criteria is patient is an adult. Story 16. I typed out a long response to this, but then deleted it because I couldn't really describe it without giving too many details away. One thing I will say is that psychopaths aren't all your classic murderous criminals. Sometimes the nicest people you'll meet are psychopaths, and it's all an act to manipulate you to do what they want or think a certain way about them, because that makes them feel like they've won and or are superior to you. Watch out for the nice guys. Answer. I did debate in college, and my partner was like this. Handsome, charismatic, popular around campus. He was always very cheerful and friendly, but I found him very frustrating the longer I knew him, because he never seemed to listen to me and would sometimes make stupid mistakes as a result. There were a handful of times when I chewed him out, and he never had a legitimate emotional response. He just gave these cold, empty assurances. It's hard to describe exactly, but after a few months of knowing him, I began to develop a bad feeling about him. He was great at disguising his lack of empathy, so it took that long before I realized how off he could be. We had one team session where we opened up about our worst qualities, and he told us he's always collected people. He doesn't really care about them, but prizes being liked and the elevated status that comes with it. He works in politics now. Story 17. So after reading a lot of these, it's worth mentioning the following. 1. Psychologists rarely even use the term psychopath anymore. Those disorders which would fall under the umbrella of psychopathy are preferred to the otherwise generic and easily confused term of psychopath. Note how many people frequently conflate psychopathy with narcissism. There's a narcissism personality disorder which fits many models of psychopathy, but not all so-called psychopaths are narcissists. 2. It often doesn't take training in psychology to spot so-called psychopaths. Formal training is needed to diagnose and treat it, but our brains are highly tuned to pick up on small things that our higher consciousness is often otherwise unaware of. This isn't to say that we should purely trust our gut. We're more often wrong than we'd like to admit, but how we feel about first impressions is often very important. 3. Far more people exhibit features of various psychopathic personality disorders than most realize. The vast majority of these people, however, live fairly ordinary, productive lives and don't exhibit violent tendencies. It has even been argued that psychopaths are an important evolutionary element, giving us people who can detach themselves from the human experience in order to provide valuable insights or behaviors the rest of us couldn't fathom. 4. Most of us will go through periods in our lives in which we often exhibit many symptoms of a personality disorder. But these are merely moments. They don't truly impact our lives in the way that a true disorder does. Story 18. I'm not a psychologist, but I know a few, have studied it extensively, and my sister works with MH in the police. He told me he tried to care how people feel, but he doesn't know how that would even come about. How do you know you care for someone? How do you not feel indifferent? He just said he has 3 emotions: indifference, anger, and pity. Story 19. Not a psychologist, but a counselor. They were talking about a disagreement they'd had with their partner. An accidental spillage of water onto some electronics. It could honestly happen to anyone. As calmly as if he was describing, I don't know, changing a channel. He started saying how he pinned his partner up against the wall and started trying to strangle her. No emotion, no change of tone, just as if it were a normal thing. I was a trainee at the time and not qualified to deal with DV. Needless to say, I transferred the client to another therapist. However, I was not allowed to end the session and had to sit with him for another 20 minutes. I've never been so scared in my life. I felt like a small prey animal trapped in the room with a predator. He just didn't care. However, if you met him, you'd think he was just a normal, successful, kinda average dude. I am 99% sure he was a sociopath because he kept trying to get certain reactions out of me, kept changing his tactics, kept trying to charm me, and when I wouldn't rise to it, became weirdly, coldly irritated. I've never had a client like it before or since. Story 20. Not a psychologist, but from my experience of dating a psychopath, didn't know until years in. A lot of what appears as emotion is simply mirroring emotions they see others exhibit and how they believe is the socially appropriate way to respond, whether or not they actually feel that way. This is how they blend in and appear normal to the average person. They are narcissistic, and everything revolves around them. They are always able to place blame on other people. Nothing is ever their fault. However, anything positive in their lives or others' lives is because of them. Because they are narcissists, they believe they are much more important than they actually are. They have strong influence over others because of their ability to feel nothing when manipulating others, and this is how they exert control over others. They will do whatever it takes in order to come out on top of a situation with no actual regard for others' lives or feelings. They may fake their feelings or reactions to continue to manipulate those around them, and they get pleasure over having control over other people and feeling like they're pulling all the strings. Answer. I used to work for a lady and her husband, who I'd bet money is a psychopath. His little daughter had a nasty accident that required brain surgery and facial reconstruction. He filmed the whole ordeal starting from moments after her fall up to bringing her home and uploaded it to YouTube. In the video after her surgery, she's sleeping and her mom is sitting vigil by her side. They are quietly talking, and her mom let out a little giggle, which I didn't find that odd. I mean, her daughter was in the clear at this point, and days of worry were finally over. She was finally relaxing. Then he leans over and said, "We shouldn't laugh. That's not an appropriate reaction to this situation." The way he said it gave me chills. I'd always suspected his emotions were fake, but this sealed it for me. I quit way before this happened because my mom was dying, and even though she was toxic and we were not close, she was still my mom and she was dying. At work that morning, he cracked a joke about it to the effect that it'd be nice if she'd hurry up and die. He thought I'd find it funny because I didn't particularly like my mom. No, dude, that was Friday. She died Sunday, and I put in my notice on Monday. Creepy fudge. My coworkers and I used to joke about all the bodies he probably had buried on his farm, but we were only half joking. Story 21. Not a psychologist, but I read a story about a neurologist that did a brain scan on himself and found out he was a psychopath. Story 22. There is so much misinformation in this thread. Lots of people who have clearly spent too much time watching Criminal Minds and reading Wikipedia pages. You technically can't even diagnose psychopathy, at least clinically. The PCLR, which people have mentioned, cherry-picked, is a list of the traits commonly seen in psychopaths and is not conclusive, as many people can display these traits and not be a psychopath as such. The very model of the traits of psychopathy is reductionist and tends to ignore the context under which the behavior takes place in favor of a quick diagnosis, as people scramble to see the motive in an offender's actions after the fact. Most people that fit the traditional behavioral role of a psychopath aren't violent offenders, but rather highly successful individuals who lean toward careers that reward their lack of empathy. It is even harder to recognize in children, and the idea of the psychopathic triad, eliminate animals, obsession with fire, and long-term bedwetting, which has long been seen to be a predictor if future violent behavior, was first posited in 1964 and has been the subject of heavy debate ever since. For some context, whenever you write any kind of paper in any psychology class, research is considered out of date after 5 years, not 55. I don't claim to be a psychologist for karma. I have studied it, but not in any amount that makes me qualified to treat people. But it needed to be said that people are shamelessly milking the classic idea of a psychopath for internet points. Openly and shamelessly narcissistic behavior, then following it with a lack of remorse or admission of guilt, and topping it off with a big old load of shallow affect, which would make most of the people commenting on this thread, as judged by themselves, psychopaths. Funny that. Answer. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I agree with you about how much misinformation there is on this thread. Psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis, and at least in the UK where I practice, it is not used clinically. There has also been a lot of discussion around personality disorders in this thread, which some might suggest is related to psychopathy. However, many practicing psychologists contest the validity or usefulness of these diagnoses too. The idea that someone's personality is disordered suggests that something is inherently wrong with the person. Of course, this adds to the shame and stigma experienced by many that receives this diagnosis. I'm aware, like with any diagnosis, some people may find comfort and solace in having a name for understanding and describing their experiences, and I would never seek to take this away from them. However, personality disorder diagnoses are potentially not valid. Multiple doctors may not agree, provide the same diagnosis when given the same information. And there has been a recent movement to think more about the experiences of those with personality difficulties in the context of trauma, e.g., complex PTSD. This also goes for better understanding people who access forensic services after they have committed a crime. Context and consideration of an individual's experiences is really important. I think that threads such as this one potentially promote misunderstanding of an extremely complex set of emotions and behaviors, which in turn contributes to stigmatizing narratives for those with severe mental health difficulties or those with a personality disorder diagnosis. Story 23. I've always wondered how many high-functioning psychopaths are out there, like people with murderous, rapey impulses, and they are just able to suppress because they know how to function in society. Story 24. The best way to know for sure is to sit down with a psychologist and tell them, without reservation, about your life and the way you experience the world. If you're more interested in self-diagnosis, although I would advise against it as it's entirely meaningless due to self-deception and bias, there are plenty of resources available online. You could easily find a copy of the DSM-5 with 5 minutes or less of online searching. If you're looking for personal experiences which align with yours, just read through Reddit. There are plenty of us floating around. Some things you could look for pretty easily too. Do you feel empathy? Have you ever felt bad for hurting someone? Do you get sad when people leave your life? Do you miss people when they leave? Are your emotions particularly strong or long-lived? Have you ever felt love? Are you generally law-abiding due to moral reasons? Do you get outraged at moral offenses? Are you prone to loneliness? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then I would say it's unlikely that you're a sociopath. But then, I'm only able to speak from my own experience, and I'm not a psychologist, so take it with a grain of salt. Story 25. Therapist here. A good sociopath will, on the surface, seem totally invested in treatment. They kind of schmooze you, try to impress you. Then eventually you catch on that they're manipulating you to think one way, while they're totally behaving opposite of what you think. Also, if you're an empath and really pick up on people's moods vibes, psychopaths just give you a big gut feeling that something isn't right. You almost feel slimy after talking to them. That's my experience anyways. Answer. I think one of the signs can be the want to get super close and personal really too fast than most people do, pushing boundaries of personal and private spaces, like someone who does a lot of massive favors for you or wants to know all your flaws and secrets, but they only met you that day. Sometimes to them, it means you might do big favors for them in return and not out of niceness. Saying no to them might see the mask slip or see them try to put you down or wear you down further, but not sure if that's just other abusive types that overlap into this. Story 26. I had one and it was so bizarre and haunting. I was doing a psych evaluation on a tween. I think he was like 12 years old, and was in the early stage of doing the clinical interview with him and his mother. The mother described various acts of violence the child had done, in addition to other things, and I listened to the child's explanations of why. After I walked them out of the office, I remember talking to a colleague that this was the first time I had encountered a sociopath in the making. Story 27. I'm a bit late to this, so not sure this will be seen, but my wife is bugging me to share. I actually started my career in forensic psychology, but decided to get out of it after I got stabbed and assaulted a few times by patients. I then started working with children and teens. It was there, working with an 8-year-old girl, we'll call her Sarah, that I came across my first person I'd earmark as a psychopath. Sarah came from a pretty good family, and they were really dedicated to help her moving forward. The parents had no obvious concerns with their own behavior, and they seemed to be pretty well-regulated folks. They had bounced across a few therapists before seeing me, most of which seemed to struggle with the fact that Sarah did not seem to be demonstrating more traditional behavioral issues, e.g., she was not impulsive, she did not just lose her temper and go wild. Instead, Sarah was attentive, planning, and meticulous. She was pretty textbook in that she had a long history of mutilated Barbies and some quite hurt animals along her path. The part that was a bit unique with Sarah is she rarely got in trouble for doing anything because it seemed that she was really good at convincing other children, usually those a bit younger than he, of doing things. We got my foot in the door by doing some psych testing with Sarah. I had a booklet in front of her. Thing costs about $200 that we use for the tests. Sarah proceeded to slowly rip one page at a time while looking me in the eye. I have a pretty good poker face. She asked me what I was going to do about it. I said nothing. She continued. After a while, she admitted that she was surprised I had not reacted yet. I told her it wasn't my booklet and that I just work here. That actually was why she stopped. The next 9 hours I spent with Sarah continued with this kind of stuff. The most uncomfortable part was that she just stared at me constantly and tried to read my face. I think she was really thrown off by my lack of expression. When she was observed with her parents, she did the exact same thing. Child Protective Services was already well involved, and everyone was kind of unsure what to do about this kid. She was, fortunately or unfortunately, about to move across the country and into a heavily wooded area. I remember her dad somewhat sadly joking, "At least the animals there might fight back." I remember the parents just seemed scared. About 6 months after she moved, one of the worst fires in the history of the area happened and destroyed entire towns. I've always wondered if it was Sarah. Story 28. Psychology student here. I got the chance to sit in on the interrogation, on a monitor in the other room, of this guy who was clearly off. He seemed like a normal enough guy, cracked a joke about the bland room and sat down, smiling like how politicians do. Just that fake but somehow authentic smile. I thought he was actually innocent at first, because most people I've seen interrogated who are guilty are really quiet, shy, and nervous, but he was confident and relaxed. To make a long story short, he was a 20-some-year-old who shoved his mother into the corner of a wall. Her head cracked open and he watched her bleed out. Through the whole interrogation, he was laughing and smiling. You could clearly tell he felt no emotional connection to his own mother and had no guilt about anything he'd done. Story 29. To start, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything, I'm a welder LOL. But this thread brought to mind someone that I worked with for a while a few years ago. I'm a pretty confident man. I'm not really intimidated by most people, but this guy, he frightened me. I was working for a small company and I was the foreman. We were looking to hire someone to replace my old job of building hydraulic parts. He was my first pick to hire out of the people we interviewed. Looking back now, I see that I was duped. He was friendly, but just way overly friendly. I remember even thinking at the time that it was almost unsettling how friendly he was. We hired him, and that changed within the first month. He didn't really seem to be interested in anyone other than himself. He had 3 children, and he treated his family like they were garbage. He bragged to me about throwing one of his son's toys down the stairs and destroying it because there were scratches on the side of it. He had a severely autistic son that they used to lock into his bedroom at night and still wore diapers at the age of 12. He refused to have him put in a care facility, even though that was seriously what needed to be done for him, at least for a while. He was very strange when it came to his daughter. He was overly attached, and I personally felt and still feel that he was or is molesting her. He told me that he bought her better clothes because girls are on a different level. He was the only one allowed to brush her hair because my wife can't do it right, and neither can my daughter. He was an absolute terror to his wife. There was hardly a day that he wasn't screaming at her, even when she did something nice like brought him food. He married her when she was 16, and she isn't allowed to see her family. He even had a charge of kidnapping when he and another underage girl tried to run off together. They made it a few states away when he was caught. He was pissed the court won't expunge his record. If you told him anything bad was happening to you, he automatically came back with something that related to him. A friend of mine had committed tragic end, and when I told him, he looked at me without any feeling whatsoever. Not even the obligatory, "Sorry about your loss, man." He would get extremely angry if you did him wrong in any way. He was also extremely manipulative and sneaky. I tried to get him a promotion before all of this showed up at the main warehouse in another state. He flew there, and I found out later when he was there, he was trying to talk them into firing me. Luckily, he blew up when they said they would not meet his demands, and they let me know what he was up to. He frightened me enough that I let my wife and mom know that if I turned up missing, that he should be considered the main suspect. IDK if he was a true psychopath or just an extremely angry narcissist. All I know is I have never met anyone like him before or since. Story 30. Had this guy in waste management being treated for dizzy spells. The more he came in, the more messed up he seemed. Had total disregard for human life, but loved animals, especially ducks and horses. It got to the point where he was untreatable, had to be sent away. I'm pretty sure he was shot having dinner with his family. Story 31. Be wary of any responses here. Psychologists are bound to strict regulations prohibiting the disclosure of patient information. Excluding names isn't enough. I've seen real psychologists claim on similar threads that all the responses were fake. Answer: I have a PhD on my way to licensure, verified in our science. I dislike these threads. They seem harmful to the trust of clients, i.e., trust that their stories will not be told for entertainment, and may perpetuate the stigma that only severely mentally ill people need the help of counseling professionals. Our ethics codes, which vary by state, say to do no harm. An ethical psychologist would avoid these threads on the mere thought that the disclosure could potentially harm their client if they found out, psychopath or not. Also, take whatever here with a huge grain of salt. There is literally nothing stopping a random person from being a psychologist for a day. Story 32. He thought it was funny. I literally had my video camera out and had already Googled the sheriff's number in case I found him dead. We went inside after I chewed him the fudge out, and he tried to tell me that he never said anything about hurting himself. He convinced me that my sister was overreacting and being dramatic. Well, my sister came home a few minutes later. I made it there before her, and she started reading the texts. Tell the kids I love them. Tell them to say their prayers, their yes ma'ams and no ma'ams. Tell them not to feel sad. I want you to be happy. I don't want you to feel guilty about this. This wasn't your fault. This has always been my destiny. I'm trying to think of more, but it was basically a straight 20 minutes of this shoot, and then he turned off his phone. So he basically wrote a tragic end note in order to get a response from my sister and just fudge lied directly to my face about it. Then, when he got confronted in front of me, he sat there talking about how he was in trouble. He lambasted my sister for calling his parents. I suggested counseling. He went off about how no mortal man can tell him about himself. So, TLDR, yesterday I realized my brother-in-law is a complete psycho. No empathy, no remorse, focused solely on himself, willing to put other people through hell just to get his way. I knew he had issues, but this is beyond anything I suspected, and he just still can't wrap his head around how awful it was. For anyone concerned, his own mother and father got involved, and they're making him stay with them until he gets some counseling. We'll see how that works out. Not really hopeful. Story 33. Not a psychologist, but I know a person who is diagnosed high on spectrum. Crazy interesting dude that you never fully trust. Met him through parties at university. He was the party guy. Always hosted the best ones. Knew tons of people. Your typical idolized party kid that everyone had wanted to be friends with. I always thought he was a liar and never really gave him a ton of my time or energy. But friends liked his parties, so we went. Went for a smoke one day and he followed me down to talk and was trying to pull all his usual stuff. The microfacial expressions explains a lot why I didn't believe him in almost everything. He slept with a lot of girls, like a lot. I never thought he seemed the type to just be a horny player. Couldn't ever put my finger on why. So he followed me down and started going off just talking, and I just kind of ignored him and pulled the thing. I had no interest in being lied to. Finally, he got fed up and started trying to turn the tables on me, saying I was stuck up, we could be great friends, etc. I had enough and said basically, no, 'cause you're a blatant liar and use people. And I've seen this going on for over a year, not interested. Then the oddest part happened. His face just went blank. And I don't mean blank like someone's in shock or anything, like scary watching a horror movie blank. I, being the dummy I am, just stood there annoyed making eye contact. It felt like forever. Finally he goes, "How do you all this?" I basically told him I could just tell. Had a gut feeling. He uses people. He uses all the girls he sleeps with, and he uses the parties as attention, not anything else. That's when, for the first time in the whole time I had ever seen him, he told the truth. Once again, I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. He has ASPD and was partially diagnosed when he was younger and confirmed when he got a bit older. I was right for his reasons why he did the stuff he did. Whole time he had this blank face with just the odd twitch on it. Then boom, he starts laughing and joking around again, trying to get a reaction from me. We had a few interactions like this over the years, and I still bump into him on odd occasions. He has always turned it into a game of when he takes girls home, or obviously manipulates people, apparently not obvious to them, of catching my eye and shooting me a wink, like we're in some private joke together. Story 34. I'm not sure if he was a confirmed psychopath. I didn't interact with him long consistently enough to find out for sure. I was introduced to G at a party. He was dating a friend of mine who I went to uni with, who we'll call M. I hadn't seen her for a while. We're both good friends with another friend, A. A was hosting a party, and M and G were there. I was introduced to G, and as soon as I went to shake his hand and met his eye contact, I knew something wasn't right. I felt the hair on the nape of my neck stand up and a shiver run down my spine. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes. I heard a little voice in the back of my head telling me to run for the hills. I met him a few times after that, and each time my lizard brain was internally screaming at me. I was on edge the whole time. I heard through A over the course of the next 6 months about how G was manipulative, controlling, and vindictive towards M, and A was seeing less and less of M. A initially tried to reassure me that I was exaggerating and making it up, when I confessed I didn't like him right off the bat. Slowly she conceded that, okay, maybe G was on the spectrum or something. Eventually she agreed that he was manipulative, but never met me at Psychopath. Either way, A and I both assisted M in leaving the relationship. She was a live-in girlfriend towards the end, and she's now happily single. A freaky nightmare for her, but a happy ending. She's had some counseling, and we've closed ranks around her, and she is now happy, sort of, that she's been through it because she feels she's less naive about the world. Story 35. Not a psychologist, but 4 days ago, after 35 years, I found out by myself that my father is either a psychopath or a intense narcissist, without him taking any guilt at all for anything, or any feeling of remorse for what he is doing. Having blamed and shamed me all my life when we were both alone, so there were never witnesses. You are the best son I can think of in public, and I'm so disappointed in you, and way more in private. Push and pull. You can't do anything right and think you are to blame. There was not much physical abuse because it seems they don't like to leave traces on your body. I did a shoot ton of personal development work on my own for 4 years and left my home country 3 years ago because I thought something was wrong with me. I was lying in bed and cried out of fear of having to go into a mental asylum many times. 3 years of separation and hundreds or even thousands of hours of contemplation and building up knowledge about personal development and many insights lead me to freedom. Only to realize that because of this history with my father, I was in a relationship with a narcissist. Because I now was very sensitive, I could feel when I got manipulated by her. I cut cords immediately. You are a honeypot for these types of personality disorders because you are already weak and an easy prey. So, chances are high that it's not only one person in your circle of friends, and you can literally trust no one who he has had any contact with at all. It is enough when people have had a nice first impression of him that they doubt everything you say, and by that increase the feeling that you already have that you are going insane. Because of this, if you have only the slightest suspicion, I'd suggest seeing a counselor, because he is a neutral person, and tell him about your suspicion. A clear sign after the break-in period where he/she gains your trust is that you feel confused, or like in my case, you think that something is wrong with your mind, or that you go insane if it goes long enough. Only after intense analyzing yourself and listening carefully how your body and mind reacts to the words spoken by that N or P, you have a slight chance to identify him/her. Also, another sign I think is overlooked too often is that when you have very low self-esteem, are insecure, constant self-doubting, etc., chances are high that you are under the influence of at least one abuser. Answer: your father sounds exactly like my mother-in-law. I wish I could convince my wife to cut contact with her, as she is super toxic and only drags my wife down any chance she gets. But she is all the family my wife has, and that's why she just can't let go. My wife has terrible self-esteem issues and always doubts herself. It took her years to see that she is not the terrible, useless person her mother made her out to be. I'm glad you got out. Story 36. Not my story, but a friend's who work in a criminal psychiatric facility. He had talks 2 days a week with an inmate there to see if he was holding up. He was in there for an unprovoked, rather brutal assault for 2 years, I think. A few months in, my friend brought up the assault and wanted to talk of the motivation behind it. His answer? Oh, this guy was walking with this gorgeous girl that I winked to, and she ignored me. So I decided I should show her there are consequences for her disrespect. The victim was hospitalized for like a month, partly due to a crushed ribcage by metal pipe. Story 37. Not a psychologist, but I was a mental health worker and unit manager at a psychiatric facility for juveniles. One of our patients was there because when he was 16, he beat a woman unconscious, tied her up with a phone cord, and violation her. When he finally got out, he called back one day to check in, a fairly common occurrence, and told me he had a girlfriend. I told him that was great and asked her name. In a voice that literally gave me chills, he said, I haven't talked to her yet. I've just been watching her. Yeah, I called his case manager in the halfway house he was staying at. Story 38. I remember a resident I worked with when I used to work one of the orderly positions during the evening shift at a facility for kids and adolescents with special needs and mental health conditions near Chicago. This resident was a young man in his early 20s who I had worked with a lot. For the most part, I actually got along with him really well, and he usually seemed to show affection towards others. However, I had been warned by experienced staff to be careful near him, as he is very strong and used to suffer from delusions. Despite the claims, he was always friendly towards me, possibly since we both had very similar hobbies and liked science fiction. But one day as I came in to work for the evening shift, I saw the staff who usually worked with him in the mornings, and his shirt had blood all over it. I was told that during school, when his staff was telling him to be more appropriate, the resident had gotten up and started punching the staff in the face, and even started beating him with items he could grab. I cannot comment on the incident as I did not see it, but I had seen the resident over time afterwards, and his sense of empathy was odd. He knew that what he did was wrong, and that other kids were now scared of him as a result of his actions. But he didn't seem to have strong feelings about the day himself. It's not that he was emotionally disconnected, because he did try to get along with most people and aimed at being more positive. In all honesty, his incidents were uncommon and possible, but still difficult to maintain. He was usually easy to approach and did well in the classes he took. And while he was there, he had struggled with his emotions as he was both in a residential facility and coping with the loss of family members at the same time. I learned that he got arrested years after he aged out of the facility for attacking a care worker at a group home. I miss the conversations with him and hope he gets a chance to turn things around. But I know that his mental condition while being in the jail system stops that ideal dead in its tracks. Story 39. Just watch The Sopranos. Spoilers. The main character, Tony Soprano, is in therapy up until the second last episode. He goes through major psychological arcs that play out every season and in smaller episodic fashion. These build upon each other until we start to see Tony spinning his wheels. Problems become recurring when he seemingly moved past them in previous seasons. His psychologist is given a heads up on research about sociopaths, how they can use psychology sessions as a tool, and how they will never make progress. This explains why in the final season, we see Tony spin his wheels over and over. Tony's been using psychological tricks learned in his therapy sessions on his opponents and human obstacles all series long, and has not been making any progress. Story 40. Not a psychologist, but grew up with a psychopath. My mother's best friend had 4 sons. The second oldest was, as my mom would put it, pure evil. He pulled the legs of insects from he was 1, eliminate frogs, and tried setting a dog on fire. When he got to 5, he tried throwing a kid into a bonfire but fell in himself and had bad burns covering a lot of his legs and torso. When he was 9, he used to hunt and torture rabbits and foxes. We knew he was also feeding cats to stray dogs by breaking their legs. 16, he pushed an old man down the stairs at a park and eliminated him. This didn't come out until he was caught later in life. By 18, he broke into an old couple's home and shot them both dead. He has been in jail ever since. Up until his conviction, his mother always thought he was normal and even her favorite. She died a few years later. The judge said he was the coldest human being he ever witnessed. Story 41. Not a psychologist, but worked in a residential treatment facility for teen boys for a while during college. My biggest takeaway was that most criminals aren't fundamentally bad. They're broken in some way and make bad choices sometimes. But there was also a degree of honor among them. We lived on a huge campus, and the cabins of patients didn't interact much. Because I was a young, small woman, I was obviously never going to be a physical match for my patients should they decide to attack me. It wasn't scary, though. I actually never felt safer than when we were transitioning to and from activities, because I knew if one of the patients in another cabin so much as looked at me wrong, my boys were not going to put up with it. They bonded to me quickly, and other staff, typically because they didn't have very many good examples of adults in their own lives. That said, there was one kid I will never forget as long as I live. This kid, let's call him D, scared the shoot out of me. D had been inpatient for over 4 years. The average stay is 6 months. He had recently stepped down from the secured cabin to our cabin, and his reputation preceded him. At first, I was naive and figured he was just misunderstood. The last time I ever got white savior complex. It eventually became clear that D's problems were deeper than I was remotely equipped to deal with. Apparently, this had been the case over the 4 years had been there. He couldn't be in a foster group home because he'd violation the other children, typically younger boys. But if he were mad enough, he'd do it to anyone he could pin down. He was essentially unadoptable and didn't want to be adopted anyway because he thought his mom would be hurt. She wasn't. She was just as scared of him as everyone else. I finally realized how bad it was when I realized he'd punish himself if in so doing he also got the satisfaction of hurting someone else. For example, he'd constantly talk shoot to the biggest guy on our cabin. The guy would ignore it until eventually D wore him down enough or said the right thing. And then the big guy would kick D's jerk, and D got hurt. But the other kid would get locked down for putting hands on someone. It delayed his release. D got off on that. He didn't care about physical pain if it meant someone else was made to suffer. One night, everything was winding down, and it was almost time for bed. D wasn't listening or participating or something. I don't even remember the exact event, only that something happened, and next thing I know, D is coming at me, and he's not holding back. He wants to eliminate me. Another therapist, a large, wonderful, patient man, pulled him back and put him into what we call a hold. It doesn't hurt, but it does pin you down. I used that time to go into the office and call for backup. There were no windows in the office, but I could hear D outside the door screaming for me to come out so he could violation me with a stapler like I deserved and other very specific threats. But even still, I thought maybe he could be rehabilitated. Then, the next day, the large man who had protected me wasn't at work. I asked about him. He was on probation because D claimed he hurt his arm while restraining him. There were cameras everywhere, and we watched the video, but when it's a fight with several people gather around like that, it can be hard to tell details. Eventually, the therapist resigned because getting fired for abuse is a quick way to end your career. It wasn't until that day that I realized the whole thing was calculated. D acted out enough that our cabin wasn't able to go to the dining hall and had to have sack lunches for dinner. He knew this would create aggravation. Then, he used the already tumultuous atmosphere to act out and get the other boys more riled. He knew if he came for me, someone would step in. He knew that it would probably not follow exact standards for a hold, or at the very least, the video would be inconclusive. He knew the therapist would quit or be fired. There was no point. The male therapist wasn't overly hard on D. He just happened to be the one on duty when D decided to ruin someone's life. It was that event that made me realize that some people aren't worth saving. I ended up moving states, taking an office job, and never returning to the city I worked in. Story 42. Knew a kid when I was 7. Stomped on an injured baby bird. He also lit a church on fire, even though his dad was a priest. My parents told me he would be a serial killer one day. No idea what happened to him, but he can't be in a good place now. Story 43. I'm going to get buried. As a social worker, I was talking to a guy with diagnosed antisocial personality disorder. It wasn't so much the lack of empathy as the way he was running in circles around questions. If I brought up his substances use, he brought up his car accident. Very obviously manipulative, trying to create multiple sob stories about he was the victim in every circumstance, including multiple assaults he had committed. About a year later, that R. Kelly Gayle King interview came out, and the similarities I saw in my client with R. Kelly was shocking. Story 44. I worked with someone once who was well known. His sidekick, as we grew to call him, was void of soul. You could look at his eyes and it was blackness staring back at you, an emptiness I've seen in the eyes of known serial killers. And when you were near him, you could almost feel a vibration of evil. It was almost like watching a mime when he was forced to interact with others. Exaggerated facial expressions, often mimicking the person speaking to him. And when they walked away, his face clicked off like a TV set, tuned to static. There's more there, but I'll not say. Answer. You could look at his eyes and it was blackness staring back at you, an emptiness I've seen in the eyes of known serial killers. And when you were near him, you could almost feel a vibration of evil. No offense, but you're probably imagining things. Many serial killers seemed perfectly normal until they were caught. People interacted with them daily without seeing an emptiness in their eyes. I mean, many young women trusted Ted Bundy. They didn't feel a vibration of evil. Exaggerated facial expressions, often mimicking the person speaking to him. That doesn't sound like psychopathy, more like some kind of autism spectrum disorder. Story 45. Not a psychologist, but knew someone who was diagnosed as a psychopath in school. We'd started on the same day, so we'd sort of gotten lumped together. People tended to avoid him because he was frankly a little odd. He didn't do anything particularly, but looking back, that was it. He didn't do anything. He didn't seem to enjoy anything. He just sort of followed everybody around. Anyway, years go by, and he and his family moved to the States. A few weeks later, my mom calls his mom and finds out some things. The guy, we'll call him E, had a rage fit and launched chairs, tables, and who knows what else through windows, doors, anything in reach. It had apparently taken 3 police officers to pin him down. During this time, he'd also apparently stripped naked. After a short interview, he was committed to a hospital where he was diagnosed as a psychopath. Sometime later, he came back here. Me and my mom ended up staying friends with the family, since I also knew E's siblings really well and I went to their house. I decided before going I wasn't going to treat him differently, as I believe even people like that deserve some form of normalcy, even if they don't understand it. Maybe it was because now I knew, but I realized just how off he was. I'm not sure what it was exactly, but he could talk about some pretty messed up stuff completely straight-faced. I specifically remember him saying he wanted to join ISIS so he could shoot people. He wasn't particularly intelligent, so I never got the Hannibal Lecter vibe, but I definitely understand what people mean by a primal sort of fear. It's the feeling of your body priming itself to bolt at the first sign of trouble, muscles tensing, subconsciously judging how quickly you can get to the door, etc. I remember one time, after a particular enlightening conversation with E about how the Jews were secretly aliens, I stepped outside for a breather and spoke to his mom in the kitchen. I knew her pretty well, since I was in my mid-teens by this point, so I asked her straight, "Mrs. E, please don't take this the wrong way, but if E has one of his moments when I'm around, what do I do?" She sighed, looked at me and said, "Whatever you have to do." She'd apparently been told by the psychology team there was a very high likelihood E would try to eliminate one of the family someday, and she'd explained to the others there was no shame in defending themselves. I haven't seen or spoken to the family in quite a few years for one reason or another, but I sometimes wonder how they are. It might seem overdramatic, but that day I did steel myself that I might end up eliminate one of my oldest friends to stop him eliminate me or one of his siblings. I rationalized it, that in that moment he wouldn't be E anymore, just a threat. That's it for this video. Don't forget to support Vancher and my second channel, Vanchus. See you soon.